I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the bulldozers rolling through Willow Creek Estates at dawn on that humid August morning in Raleigh, North Carolina. The engines rumbled like thunder, shaking my bedroom window as I poured my first cup of coffee. I'm Victor Lawson, and I'd lived in this subdivision for 3 years, long enough to know that construction work wasn't supposed to start until 9 o'clock on weekdays. According to our HOA bylaws, it was barely 6:30. I stepped onto my front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the massive yellow machines lumber down Cedar Ridge Drive toward the back section of our development, where the last dozen lots sat empty. My neighbor Frank was already outside in his bathrobe, squinting against the early morning sun. "You seeing this?" Frank called across our shared property line. "Hard to miss," I replied, walking over to the white picket fence that separated our yards. Thought Jensen Development said they weren't breaking ground on Phase 3 until next spring. Frank shook his head. "Got an email last week. Board approved an expedited timeline. Something about market conditions and investor pressure." I frowned. Our HOA board had been making a lot of decisions lately without proper community input. The president, a woman named Patricia Whitmore, ran the association like her own personal fiefdom. She'd been pushing hard to get the remaining lots developed, something about increasing property values and expanding the community amenity fund. But this felt rushed. Over the next few hours, more neighbors emerged to watch the spectacle. The construction crew worked with startling efficiency, clearing brush and marking survey stakes across the undeveloped parcels. By lunch, 3 excavators were tearing into the earth, ripping up vegetation and leveling the gentle slope that led down to what we'd always called Miller's Creek, a small waterway that meandered through the back of our property. The creek wasn't much to look at during summer, just a trickling stream that swelled during heavy rains. Kids played there sometimes, catching tadpoles and building tiny rock dams. Nobody paid it much attention, really. It was just part of the natural landscape, bordered by willow trees and thick undergrowth that provided a green buffer between our manicured lawns and the wooded area beyond. By Wednesday afternoon, the creek was gone. I couldn't believe it when I walked the property line that evening. Where Miller's Creek had flowed for probably thousands of years, there was now nothing but compacted dirt and gravel. The construction crew had literally paved over the entire waterway, filling it in with tons of aggregate material and running a massive drainage pipe underneath to divert the water somewhere else. The willow trees were gone, ripped out by their roots and hauled away in dump trucks. The whole area looked like a construction zone on the moon. "They can't do this," my wife Melanie said when I showed her pictures on my phone that night. "That's wetland. There are protections for this kind of thing." "I'm calling Patricia tomorrow," I said. "This doesn't feel right." But Patricia Whitmore didn't answer my calls the next day, or the day after that. I left 3 voicemails requesting information about the creek, about permits, about environmental assessments. Nothing. Finally, on Saturday morning, I drove to her house on Magnolia Court and knocked on her door. Patricia answered wearing tennis whites and oversized sunglasses, clearly annoyed by the interruption. She was probably 55, with carefully highlighted blonde hair and the kind of fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Victor, this really isn't a good time," she said, not inviting me inside. "I have a match at the club in 20 minutes. Then I'll be quick," I said. "What happened to Miller's Creek?" "The construction crew completely destroyed it." She waved a dismissive hand. "That little drainage ditch? It was impeding development. Jensen Development needed the land flat and stable for the new homes. The board approved the modification months ago." "Modification?" "They paved over a natural waterway. They installed proper drainage infrastructure," Patricia corrected, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she wanted to end a conversation. "Everything is completely up to code. Jensen has all the necessary permits from the county." "What about environmental permits?" "That creek is probably protected wetland." Patricia's smile tightened. "Victor, I appreciate your concern, but the board has consulted with legal experts and Jensen's engineering team. Everything is perfectly legal now, if you'll excuse me." She closed the door before I could respond. I spent the weekend researching. Turns out, Melanie was right. North Carolina has strict regulations about modifying or filling wetlands, and streams are protected under both state and federal law. Any construction project that impacts a waterway requires permits from multiple agencies, including the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. The more I read, the more concerned I became. Monday morning, I called the North Carolina Division of Water Resources. After being transferred 3 times, I reached a compliance officer named David Chen, who listened to my description of what had happened. "And you said this occurred when?" he asked. "Last week. They filled the entire creek bed in less than 3 days." I heard typing on the other end. "What's the address of the development?" I gave him the information, including Jensen Development's name and the HOA details. Chen was quiet for a moment. "I'm not showing any permits filed for that location," he said finally. "Let me make some calls. Can you send me photographs?" I emailed him everything I had. 2 days later, I received a call from an EPA investigator named Sarah Mendez. Her voice was professional but serious. "Mr. Lawson, I'm calling regarding your complaint about Willow Creek Estates. We've initiated a preliminary investigation, and I need to ask you some questions." For the next hour, I walked Sarah through everything I'd witnessed. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, the construction methods, the HOA's involvement, and what had happened to the water that used to flow through the creek. "Has the developer or the HOA provided any documentation about permits or environmental assessments?" she asked. The HOA president told me Jensen Development had all necessary county permits, but she didn't specify which ones. "County permits aren't sufficient for this type of work," Sarah said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this is a significant Clean Water Act violation. We'll need to conduct a site inspection." The next week, everything exploded. 3 vehicles from the EPA arrived at Willow Creek Estates on a Thursday morning. Sarah Mendez and 2 other investigators spent 6 hours documenting the construction site, taking soil samples, photographing the filled creek bed, and measuring water flow patterns. By Friday, the construction site was shut down with official stop work orders posted at every entrance. Patricia Whitmore showed up at my house that evening, her face red with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she shouted from my driveway. I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. "I reported a potential environmental violation," I said calmly, "which is apparently exactly what happened. You've cost this community millions. Jensen Development has stopped all work pending the EPA investigation. Those homes were supposed to generate HOA dues revenue. We were counting on that money for community improvements. Maybe the board should have verified the permits before approving the project," I said. Patricia's hands clenched into fists. "The board acted in good faith based on information provided by the developer. You've made enemies here, Victor. Don't be surprised when things get difficult for you." It wasn't an idle threat. Within 2 weeks, I received my first citation from the HOA. Apparently, my mailbox was the wrong shade of black and needed to be repainted to match community standards. Then my lawn was measured and found to be a 1/4 inch too long. Then my garbage cans were visible from the street for 7 minutes past the allowable window on trash collection day. Melanie was furious. "They're targeting us," she said, reading through the 3rd notice in as many days. "This is harassment." "Documented harassment," I corrected, photographing each citation. "Let them keep going. It only proves retaliation." But the HOA's petty revenge was nothing compared to what was brewing with the EPA. In late September, I received a letter informing me that I was being called as a witness in an enforcement action against both Jensen Development and the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The EPA had completed its investigation and determined that Miller's Creek was indeed a protected waterway under the Clean Water Act, and that filling it without proper permits constituted a major environmental violation. The letter outlined what the EPA had discovered. Miller's Creek wasn't just some seasonal drainage ditch. It was a year-round tributary that fed into Swift Creek, which eventually connected to the Neuse River. The creek bed supported multiple protected species, including certain salamanders and freshwater mussels that were on the state's endangered species watch list. The wetland buffer around the creek provided critical flood control and water filtration for the entire area. Jensen Development had destroyed approximately 1,200 linear feet of protected stream without any federal permits whatsoever. The company had obtained basic construction permits from Wake County, but had never disclosed the creek modification in their permit applications. When county inspectors asked about drainage plans, Jensen had provided engineered drawings that showed the creek remaining intact with appropriate buffers. The actual construction bore no resemblance to the approved plans. But here's where things got complicated for the HOA. The EPA investigation revealed that the Willow Creek Estates Board hadn't just passively approved Jensen's plans. Patricia Whitmore and two other board members, Sharon Kleinfeld and Robert Morrison, had actively participated in planning the creek removal. Email records subpoenaed by the EPA showed extensive correspondence between the board members and Jensen's project manager discussing how to deal with the wetland issue and expedite the drainage solution. In one particularly damning email from June, Patricia had written, "We can't let some muddy creek hold up development. The community needs those dues payments and Jensen needs to move forward. Let's get this done quickly before any environmental people start asking questions." Sharon Kleinfeld had replied, "Agreed. Once it's filled and paved, it'll be too late for anyone to object. Easier to ask forgiveness than permission." The EPA was not amused. In October, I attended a mandatory community meeting where Patricia was forced to address the situation. The room was packed, every seat filled with homeowners who'd been reading news coverage of the EPA investigation. Patricia stood at the podium looking significantly less confident than usual, flanked by the HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Gerald Hastings. "As you're all aware," Patricia began, her voice strained, "there has been some regulatory confusion regarding the Phase 3 development. The board wants to assure everyone that we acted in good faith based on information provided by Jensen Development." "That's a lie," someone shouted from the back. I recognized Tom Brennan, a retired engineer who lived on Oakmont Drive. "I've read the emails, Patricia. They're public record now. You knew exactly what you were doing." The room erupted in angry voices. Gerald Hastings stood up, raising his hands for quiet. "Please, everyone, let's maintain order. The board is cooperating fully with the EPA investigation. We've retained environmental counsel and we're working to resolve this situation." "Resolve it how?" called out Jennifer Martinez, a young mother who'd moved in last year. "The EPA is talking about millions in fines. Where's that money going to come from?" That was the question everyone wanted answered. Gerald cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The HOA's insurance policy covers certain liabilities. We're in discussions with our carrier about coverage for this incident." "And if insurance doesn't cover it?" I asked from my seat near the front. Gerald met my eyes. "Then the HOA would need to assess the membership to cover any judgments or settlements." The room exploded again. Assessment meant every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates would be hit with a special fee to pay for the board's illegal actions. People started shouting questions, accusations, demands for the board to resign. Patricia tried to regain control, but it was useless. The meeting devolved into chaos and was eventually adjourned with nothing resolved. Walking back to my house with Melanie, I felt the weight of what was coming. "This is going to get ugly," I said. She squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing. That creek needed protecting." "I know, but our neighbors are going to be paying for the board's mistakes." Over the next 2 months, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Jensen Development declared bankruptcy, citing the EPA fines and the cost of potential remediation. The company's assets were liquidated, leaving the half-finished Phase 3 construction site as a muddy wasteland. The HOA's insurance company denied coverage, arguing that the board's intentional misconduct fell outside the policy's scope. In December, the EPA issued its formal penalty assessment. The total fines came to $7.3 million. Jensen Development's bankruptcy meant the company would pay almost nothing. The EPA held the HOA jointly and severally liable for the entire amount, since the board had been active participants in the illegal creek filling. $7.3 million. Willow Creek Estates had about 450 homes. If the fine was divided equally, every homeowner would owe over $16,000. The news hit like a bomb. People who'd saved for years to buy homes in our development were suddenly facing financial ruin through no fault of their own. Patricia, Sharon, and Robert all resigned from the board immediately. Their attorney advised them to distance themselves from the HOA's liability, though that ship had already sailed. A new emergency board was elected, made up of homeowners who'd had nothing to do with the creek fiasco. I was approached about serving but declined. I'd done my part by reporting the violation. Now I just wanted to see justice done. The new board, led by President Linda Kaufman, hired a specialized attorney named Martin Price who focused on environmental liability cases. Martin was in his 60s, with gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen everything. At a January community meeting, he laid out our options. The good news is that the EPA is willing to negotiate, Martin said. They understand that most homeowners had no knowledge of the illegal activity. The bad news is that they won't simply waive the penalties. The Clean Water Act violations were serious, and the environmental damage is extensive. What kind of negotiation are we talking about? Linda asked. The EPA has proposed a settlement that would reduce the fine to $3.8 million if we agree to fund a complete creek restoration. That means excavating all the fill material, restoring the natural channel, replanting native vegetation, and monitoring the site for 5 years to ensure successful recovery. How much would restoration cost? Someone asked. Approximately $2.2 million, Martin said. So altogether, we're looking at $6 million in total liability, but spread over a payment plan rather than due immediately. The math was still devastating. $6 million divided by 450 homes meant over $13,000 per household. People started crying. One man stood up and said he'd have to sell his house, take a loss, and move his family into an apartment. A woman said this would wipe out her retirement savings. But there was no alternative. The EPA had the legal authority to place liens on every property in Willow Creek Estates if we didn't pay. They could force foreclosures if necessary. We were trapped. Then Linda dropped another bomb. There's also the matter of criminal charges, she said quietly. The U.S. Attorney's Office has opened a criminal investigation into Patricia Whitmore, Sharon Kleinfeld, and Robert Morrison for conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act. This changed everything. If the former board members faced criminal charges, they might also face personal liability for the fines. The room buzzed with speculation. Over the following weeks, Martin worked to negotiate a settlement that would shift more liability to the individuals who'd actually committed the violations. The EPA was willing to work with us, especially after Martin provided evidence showing that the board had hidden their actions from the general membership. Most homeowners had never seen the development plans and had no idea the creek was being destroyed until it was too late. In February, the U.S. attorney filed charges. Patricia Whitmore, Sharon Kleinfeld, and Robert Morrison were each indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act and 1 count of making false statements to federal investigators. Apparently, all 3 had lied during initial EPA interviews, claiming they'd relied entirely on Jensen Development's assurances and had never questioned the permit status. The email evidence told a different story. I was called to testify before the grand jury. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp woman named Amanda Torres, walked me through everything I'd witnessed. I described the construction timeline, my conversation with Patricia, the HOA's retaliatory citations, and the community meeting where the board had tried to deflect blame. Did you ever receive any communication from the board about potential environmental concerns regarding the development? Amanda asked. Never, I said. The board presented Phase 3 as a routine expansion. They never mentioned the creek or any regulatory issues. And when you raised concerns with Mrs. Whitmore, how did she respond? She dismissed them, told me everything was legal and that I should mind my own business. Amanda nodded, making notes. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Your testimony has been very helpful. The criminal trial was scheduled for May. In the meantime, Martin Price negotiated a civil settlement with the EPA that I thought was as good as we could hope for under the circumstances. The final terms were complex, but the core elements were these. The HOA would pay $1.8 million in civil penalties over 5 years. The former board members would be personally liable for an additional $1 million, split 3 ways. The remaining $1 million in reduced penalties was contingent on successful creek restoration, which the HOA would fund through a combination of special assessments and a loan secured against our common area assets. It wasn't perfect, but it meant homeowners would face assessments of around $4,000 each instead of $13,000, spread over 5 years. Still painful, but survivable for most families. The settlement required approval from a majority of homeowners. Linda called another community meeting in March to present the terms. I sat near the back this time, watching my neighbors wrestle with an impossible situation. "I know this is difficult," Linda said, her voice heavy with emotion. "None of us asked for this, none of us deserve this. But if we don't accept these terms, the alternative is much worse. The EPA can and will pursue full penalties plus legal costs. We could be looking at assessments double or triple this amount." "What about the criminal case?" Tom Brennan asked. "If Patricia and the others are convicted, can we sue them to recover our costs?" Martin fielded this question. "We can and will pursue civil claims against the former board members for breach of fiduciary duty. However, I need to be realistic with you. These individuals don't have millions in personal assets. Even if we win judgments, collection will be limited. Patricia's house is probably worth $500,000 with a mortgage of $300,000. Sharon rents. Robert has some retirement accounts, but they're largely protected from creditors. We might recover a few $100,000 total, which would help, but it won't eliminate the assessments." The vote was called. The settlement passed with 82% approval. People voted for it not because they liked it, but because there was no real choice. I paid my first assessment installment in April, $800, with 4 more annual payments to follow. Melanie and I could afford it, but it stung knowing we were paying for someone else's criminal behavior. The criminal trial began on May 15th. I took 2 days off work to attend. The federal courthouse in Raleigh was an imposing building, all marble and security checkpoints. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional quality. Patricia, Sharon, and Robert sat at the defense table with their attorneys. Patricia looked diminished somehow, her usual confidence replaced by fear. Sharon kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Robert stared straight ahead, expressionless. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Amanda Torres presented the email evidence, showing clear knowledge of the environmental violations and intentional efforts to conceal the creek, destruction from both regulators and homeowners. She called EPA investigators who described the extent of the damage and the protected species that had been destroyed. She called county officials who testified that Jensen's approved permits bore no resemblance to the actual construction. And she called me. I took the stand on the second day, swearing to tell the truth. Amanda walked me through my testimony again, asking about the construction timeline and my interactions with Patricia. "When Mrs. Whitmore told you that everything was perfectly legal, did you believe her?" Amanda asked. "At the time, I wanted to," I said. "She was the HO president. I assumed she'd done her due diligence. But it didn't feel right, which is why I contacted the state environmental office. The defense attorneys tried to paint me as a troublemaker, someone with a grudge against the HOA board. Patricia's lawyer, a slick guy named Richard Voss, suggested I'd manufactured the crisis to embarrass Patricia over some previous dispute. "Isn't it true that Mrs. Whitmore had cited you for multiple covenant violations?" Richard asked. "After I reported the creek violation," I said. "Not before. That was retaliation, or it was enforcement of existing rules that you'd been ignoring." "My mailbox was the wrong shade of black," I said flatly. "That's not legitimate enforcement. That's harassment." The judge sustained an objection, but the point was made. The most damaging testimony came from Jensen Development's former project manager, a man named Keith Holloway, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Keith described multiple meetings with the HOA board where they'd explicitly discussed avoiding environmental review. Patricia said the creek was an impediment to maximizing lot yield, Keith testified. She wanted it gone. Sharon suggested we could just fill it quickly and claim it was a drainage improvement. Robert said as long as the county didn't object, federal agencies would never know. "Did anyone express concern about the legality of this approach?" Amanda asked. "No. They were all focused on getting the development completed as fast as possible." Patricia kept talking about the dues revenue and how the community needed the income. Richard Voss tried to discredit Keith during cross-examination, pointing out that he'd made a deal to avoid prosecution himself. But Keith's testimony matched the email record too perfectly to dismiss. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the foreperson read the verdicts. Guilty on all counts for all three defendants. Patricia started crying. Sharon put her face in her hands. Robert just closed his eyes. Sentencing was scheduled for July. Federal sentencing guidelines for Clean Water Act violations could mean prison time, especially with the conspiracy charges. Martin Price told us that the former board members were also facing the EPA's personal fines of $333,000 each, plus whatever civil judgments we obtained in our HOA lawsuit. Their lives are effectively ruined, Martin said without sympathy, which they deserve. The creek restoration began in June. I volunteered to help with the planning committee, figuring I owed it to the community to see this through. We hired an environmental engineering firm called EcoStream Solutions that specialized in wetland restoration. Their lead ecologist, a woman named Dr. Rachel Kim, was passionate about the project. What happened here was terrible, Rachel said during our first site meeting, standing at the edge of the filled creek bed. But the good news is that restoration is possible. The underlying hydrology is still intact. Once we remove the fill material and regrade the channel, water will flow naturally again. We'll replant native species and install erosion controls. Within 5 years, you won't be able to tell this was ever damaged. The work was extensive. Excavators carefully removed tons of fill material, trucking it to an approved disposal site. Environmental monitors watched for any artifacts or contamination. Gradually, the natural creek channel emerged, deeper and wider than I'd remembered. Once the excavation was complete, Rachel's team brought in thousands of native plants: river birch, willow, buttonbush, cardinal flower, swamp milkweed. Volunteers from the community, including me, spent weekends planting and mulching. It felt good to do something positive after months of legal battles and financial stress. Melanie came with me on Saturdays, working alongside neighbors to restore what had been destroyed. Kids from the neighborhood got involved, learning about ecosystems and water quality. What had started as a disaster was slowly becoming an opportunity for the community to come together. The sentencing hearing in July was packed with observers. I sat in the gallery watching Patricia, Sharon, and Robert stand before the judge to learn their fates. The judge, a stern woman named Helen Pritchard, reviewed each defendant's case individually. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Pritchard said, looking at Patricia over her reading glasses, "You held a position of trust within your community. Homeowners relied on you to act in their best interests. Instead, you participated in a scheme to destroy a protected waterway for financial gain. Your actions have caused environmental harm that will take years to remedy and have imposed severe financial hardship on hundreds of innocent families." Patricia's lawyer made an impassioned plea for leniency, arguing that Patricia had no prior criminal record and had already suffered enormously from the conviction and the financial penalties. Judge Pritchard was unmoved. 18 months in federal prison, she said, followed by 2 years supervised release. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $333,000 to the EPA. Comply with all civil judgments entered against you. Sharon received 15 months. Robert, who had less involvement according to the evidence, received 12 months. All three would also have to complete community service focused on environmental restoration projects after their release. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been done, but it didn't erase the damage. Our community was still paying for what they'd done. Families were still struggling with assessment payments. But the creek was flowing again. I visited the restoration site in August, after the construction crews had finished their work. The channel looked raw and new, the banks still showing fresh dirt around the young plants. But water was moving through it, clear and steady, following the path it had taken for thousands of years. Rachel had installed informational signs explaining the restoration process and the importance of protecting wetlands. Standing there beside the creek, watching water tumble over newly placed rocks, I thought about everything that had happened. A year ago, this had been a peaceful community with a hidden problem. Now that problem was solved, painfully and expensively, but solved. Patricia, Sharon, and Robert were going to prison. Jensen Development was bankrupt. The EPA had sent a message that environmental violations wouldn't be tolerated. And Willow Creek Estates had learned a hard lesson about accountability and oversight. Linda Kaufman, our new HOA president, had implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future disasters. All board meetings were now recorded and minutes posted online within 48 hours. Any development plans had to be reviewed by independent consultants before board approval. Homeowners had the right to petition for special votes on major decisions. The board's authority had been checked and balanced in ways that should have existed from the beginning. Melanie joined me at the creek, carrying a blanket and a picnic basket. "Thought you might want lunch," she said. We sat on the bank, eating sandwiches and watching dragonflies skim across the water's surface. Already life was returning to the restored habitat. Rachel had told us that within a year, they expected to see salamanders and mussels re-establishing themselves. The ecosystem was resilient, given a chance to recover. "Think we'll stay?" Melanie asked. "A lot of people are talking about selling once the assessments are paid off." I considered this. The past year had been exhausting and expensive, but watching the creek flow past us, seeing the green shoots of new growth along the banks, I felt invested in this place in a way I hadn't before. "Yeah," I said. "I think we'll stay. This is home now." "And we fought for it." She leaned against my shoulder. "You fought for it. A lot of people weren't happy with you for a while." That was true. For months I'd been the pariah of Willow Creek Estates, the guy who'd blown the whistle and triggered the catastrophe. But opinions had shifted once the criminal trial revealed the extent of the board's deception. People realized I hadn't created the problem, I just exposed it. If anything, I'd prevented an even worse outcome. If the creek destruction had gone undiscovered, the EPA would have eventually found out anyway, and the fines would have been even larger without any opportunity for the negotiated settlement. Tom Brennan walked by on the new nature trail that had been installed as part of the restoration. He waved when he saw us. "Looking good, Victor," he called out. "Rachel says the water quality tests are excellent." "That's great news," I replied. Tom joined us at the creek bank. Got to say, I wasn't sure we'd survive this mess. But the community's stronger than I thought. People really pulled together once we knew the truth. That was the silver lining in all of this. Adversity had forged connections between neighbors who'd previously just waved politely from their driveways. We'd attended meetings together, volunteered together, fought together against the injustice of being held liable for crimes we didn't commit. Willow Creek Estates felt more like a real community now, not just a collection of houses. The civil lawsuit against Patricia, Sharon, and Robert was still pending. Martha was pursuing claims for breach of fiduciary duty and negligence. We'd probably recover some money eventually, though not nearly enough to cover all the homeowner assessments. Still, every dollar helped. In September, I attended the annual homeowner meeting, my first since the disaster began. The turnout was huge, nearly 300 people cramming into the clubhouse. Linda presented the annual budget, which included line items for the ongoing creek monitoring and the assessment payment schedule. "I know these assessments are a burden," Linda said, "but I want to show you what we've accomplished with the restoration." She played a video that Rachel's team had produced, showing before and after images of the creek. The difference was stunning. Where there had been a barren wasteland of compacted fill, there was now a thriving riparian corridor with flowing water, lush vegetation, and visible wildlife. The video ended with footage of a blue heron fishing in one of the creek pools, a species that hadn't been seen in our area for years. The room erupted in applause. "We've also received notification from the EPA," Linda continued. "They've completed their first-year monitoring review and determined that restoration is proceeding better than expected. As a result, they're reducing our remaining penalty payments by 15%. More applause. 15% might not sound like much, but it translated to real money for every homeowner. My remaining assessments would drop by about $120 total. Not life-changing, but welcomed. Linda also announced that the HOA had filed a claim against the title insurance company that had handled the original development. The argument was that the title insurer should have identified the environmental restrictions on the property before Jensen began development. It was a long shot, but if successful, it could yield another source of recovery funds. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to thank me for reporting the violation. Frank, my fence-line neighbor, shook my hand vigorously. "I gave you a hard time last year," he said. "I was wrong. You saved us from something worse. I just did what needed doing, I replied, uncomfortable with the attention. Still, took guts. A lot of people would have looked the other way. As the crowd dispersed, I walked home under a September sky, turning pink and orange with sunset. The air smelled like cut grass and the faint mineral scent of creek water. Children played in yards, their laughter carrying across the subdivision. Life in Willow Creek Estates was returning to normal, or at least a new normal shaped by the lessons we'd learned. Patricia began serving her sentence in October. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd been assigned to a minimum security facility in West Virginia. Sharon and Robert went to facilities in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, respectively. Their houses sat empty, both listed for sale to help pay their fines and legal bills. No one from the neighborhood attended their sentencing or showed them any support. The betrayal had been too complete. The restoration continued through fall and into winter. Rachel's team installed monitoring wells to track groundwater levels and conducted monthly surveys of plant survival and wildlife activity. I joined the volunteer monitoring program, learning to identify different species of aquatic insects that indicated water quality. It was fascinating work, watching the ecosystem rebuild itself one organism at a time. In December, Linda organized a community celebration at the creek. We gathered on a cold Sunday afternoon. Probably 100 neighbors bundled in coats and scarves. Rachel gave a presentation on what had been accomplished and what still lay ahead. Year 1 is about stabilization, she explained. We've re-established the basic structure. Years 2 through 5 will be about maturation and complexity. The vegetation will fill in, creating shade and habitat. Organic matter will accumulate, supporting more diverse insect populations. Those insects will attract amphibians and birds. Eventually, the system will reach a stable equilibrium that can sustain itself with minimal intervention. A little girl raised her hand. Will the tadpoles come back? Rachel smiled. They already have. We found 3 species of frogs breeding in the creek pools this summer. The girl beamed with delight. We unveiled a permanent sign at the creek's edge, installed by the HOA as part of the settlement agreement. It read, Miller's Creek Restoration Site, Protected Waterway. This area was illegally destroyed in 2025 and restored through Community Effort 2026-2027, protected under the Clean Water Act. Beneath was information about wetland ecology and the importance of environmental protection. It served as both an educational tool and a permanent reminder of what had happened. Standing at the dedication, looking at the sign and the restored creek behind it, I felt a sense of closure finally settling over the whole experience. We'd been through something terrible, but we'd survived. The environment had been harmed, but it was healing. Justice had been served, imperfectly but substantially. Melanie squeezed my hand. You thinking about what you'd change if you could go back? She asked. I considered this. I reported sooner, I said. The moment I saw those bulldozers, every day they worked made the damage worse. But you didn't know what they were going to do. No, but I had instincts. I should have trusted them. She nodded. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. You stood up when it mattered. We stayed at the creek until sunset, watching the water flow past the memorial sign and continue on its ancient path toward Swift Creek, and eventually the Neuse River. The water didn't care about HOA politics or EPA fines or criminal prosecutions. It just flowed, patient and persistent, following gravity and geology toward the sea. Over the following months, I settled into a routine. Work, family, the occasional HOA meeting that were blessedly boring now that competent people were in charge. I paid my quarterly assessment without complaint, viewing it as the price of citizenship in a community that had learned hard lessons about responsibility. The criminal convictions had ripple effects beyond Willow Creek Estates. The local news media had covered the case extensively, using it as an example of HOA overreach and environmental crime. State legislature proposed new laws requiring HOA boards to obtain independent review of any development plans involving natural features. The North Carolina Association of Realtors added environmental disclosure requirements to their standard contracts. Patricia's, Sharon's, and Robert's prosecutions also attracted attention from U.S. attorneys in other districts. Apparently, HOA-related environmental violations were more common than people realized. the Justice Department announced a new initiative to investigate similar cases nationwide. Our disaster had become a cautionary tale. In March of the following year, the civil lawsuit finally settled. Patricia, Sharon, and Robert agreed to pay a combined $575,000 to the HOA, tied primarily through the forced sales of their houses and retirement accounts. It wasn't the million we'd hoped for, but Martin Price said it was probably the maximum we could realistically collect. The board voted to distribute the settlement funds as credits against homeowner assessments. Each household received about $1,200 in relief, a welcome reduction in the remaining balance we owed. By spring, the creek restoration was well into its second year. The planted vegetation had filled in dramatically, creating a lush green corridor that looked almost natural. Rachel's monitoring showed steady improvement in all ecological indicators. The endangered salamander species had been documented at the site, a particularly promising sign. I brought my nephew Joshua to see the creek one Saturday in April. He was 8 years old and obsessed with animals. We walked the nature trail, identifying birds and looking for tracks in the mud along the banks. "Uncle Victor, why did someone fill in the creek?" Joshua asked. I knelt down beside him. Some people thought it would be easier to build houses if they got rid of the creek. They didn't think about all the animals that needed it, or the water that flows through it, or the laws that protect it. "That was dumb," Joshua said. "Yeah, it was, but we fixed it, and now everyone knows how important it is to protect places like this." We spotted a turtle sunning on a log, its shell gleaming in the afternoon light. Joshua watched in fascination as the turtle slipped into the water with barely a ripple. "I'm glad you fixed it," he said. "Me too, buddy." The following month, Patricia, Sharon, and Robert were released from federal prison on graduated schedules. They'd served their time and were beginning supervised release. None of them returned to Willow Creek Estates. Patricia moved to Florida to live with her sister. Sharon relocated to Virginia. Robert moved to a small town in the mountains where nobody knew his history. Their departures closed another chapter of the saga. The neighborhood could finally move forward without the uncomfortable presence of the people who'd betrayed us. In June, Linda called a special meeting to announce that the EPA had completed its final review of Year 1 restoration monitoring. The results exceeded all benchmarks. Water quality was excellent, vegetation survival was over 90%, and wildlife diversity had increased dramatically. Based on these results, the EPA agreed to reduce the remaining civil penalties by an additional 25%. The room erupted in cheers. This meant the total financial burden on homeowners would be about 30% less than originally projected. My remaining assessment balance dropped to under $1,500, manageable enough to pay off entirely if I wanted to. The meeting turned into an impromptu celebration. Someone brought champagne. People hugged and laughed and shared stories about how far we'd come. It felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sunlight. Tom Brennan raised his glass in a toast. To Victor Lawson, who had the courage to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy, glasses clinked. People cheered. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and pride. Melanie kissed my cheek. "Speech," someone called out. I stood reluctantly. Public speaking wasn't my thing, but the moment demanded it. I didn't do anything special. I started. I saw something wrong and reported it. That's what any of us should do. But I want to thank all of you for how you responded once the truth came out. You could have turned on each other. You could have given up. Instead, you came together, did the hard work of restoration, and held the people responsible accountable. That's what makes a real community. I'm honored to live among you. More applause. I sat down quickly, relieved it was over. The summer passed peacefully. The creek became a gathering spot for neighborhood families. Kids played in the shallow pools, catching minnows and building tiny dams from pebbles. Parents walked the nature trail in the evenings, enjoying the shade and the sound of running water. The restored wetland had become the heart of Willow Creek Estates in a way the old drainage ditch never was. In August, a documentary crew from a local PBS station visited to film a skimmet about the restoration for an environmental series they were producing. They interviewed Rachel, Linda, and me, capturing footage of the creek and the surrounding habitat. The interviewer, a young woman named Claire, asked me what I'd learned from the experience. That environmental protection isn't abstract, I said. It's not just about polar bears or rainforests somewhere far away. It's about the creek in your backyard, the water you drink, the air you breathe. And it's everyone's responsibility to speak up when they see something wrong, even if it's uncomfortable or unpopular. Any advice for other homeowners who might face similar situations? Claire asked. Trust your instincts, ask questions, demand transparency from people in authority, and don't assume someone else will handle it. If you see something that doesn't look right, investigate. The cost of speaking up is almost always less than the cost of staying silent. The documentary aired in October. I watched it with Melanie and several neighbors gathered at our house. It was strange seeing myself on television, but the segment did a good job of explaining what had happened and highlighting the successful restoration. At the end, the narrator concluded, "The Willow Creek Estates case demonstrates both the importance of environmental enforcement and the resilience of natural systems when given a chance to heal. What began as an environmental crime has become a model for community-led restoration and accountability." As the credits rolled, Frank raised his beer. "We're famous." "Infamous," I corrected. "Either way, they're going to use this in environmental law classes for years." He was right. Martin Price had told us that law professors were already assigning the Willow Creek case in courses on environmental regulation and HOA governance. Our disaster had educational value, at least. By the end of the year, the final assessment payments were coming due. I paid my balance in full in December, closing the financial chapter of the saga. The HOA sent a letter thanking everyone for their patience and cooperation over the past 18 months. Attached was a beautiful aerial photograph of the restored creek, taken by a professional photographer Rachel had hired. The image showed the meandering waterway cutting through lush vegetation, a ribbon of blue-green water bordered by thriving wetland habitat. I framed the photograph and hung it in my home office, a reminder of what we'd been through and what we'd accomplished. The new year brought fresh starts. The last undeveloped lots in Willow Creek Estates were sold to a different builder, one that Linda and the board had vetted extensively. This developer had impeccable environmental credentials and submitted to rigorous independent review before breaking ground. The new homes would be set back from the creek with enhanced buffers, following best practices for low-impact development. In February, the EPA sent its final closure letter. All monitoring requirements had been met. All penalty payments had been satisfied. The restoration was deemed successful, and ongoing monitoring would be the HOA's responsibility rather than a federal mandate. We were officially released from EPA oversight. Linda framed the closure letter and hung it in the clubhouse alongside the creek photograph, symbols of the journey we'd taken. I ran into Tom at the hardware store one Saturday morning in March. We talked about lawn care and the upcoming homeowner meeting and the strange warm weather we'd been having. "You know what I realized the other day?" Tom said as we walked to our cars. "I actually like living here more now than I did before all this happened. We know each other. We trust each other. We've been through something together." I knew exactly what he meant. Willow Creek Estates felt like home in a deeper way than it had when I'd first moved in. Not because of the houses or the amenities, but because of the shared experience of crisis and recovery. "Think we'll ever see Patricia or Sharon or Robert again?" Tom asked. "I doubt it. Their lives here are over. They know they're not welcome." "Good," Tom said without hesitation. They made their choices. Driving home, I thought about justice and consequences and redemption. Patricia, Sharon, and Robert had paid a heavy price for their crimes. Prison time, financial ruin, public humiliation, and permanent criminal records. Part of me felt sympathy for how completely their lives had been destroyed. But a larger part remembered the families struggling to pay assessments, the environmental damage that had been inflicted, and the betrayal of trust that had nearly torn apart our community. They'd earned their consequences. The creek restoration entered its third year in spring. Rachel's team conducted their annual monitoring survey and reported continued improvement across all metrics. The ecosystem was maturing beautifully, developing the complexity and resilience that characterized healthy wetlands. I volunteered for a planting day in April, joining 20 other neighbors to add additional native vegetation along the creek banks. We worked in teams, digging holes and settling young trees and shrubs into the rich soil. My hands got dirty, my back got sore, and I felt deeply satisfied with the honest physical labor of environmental stewardship. A local elementary school adopted the creek as an outdoor classroom. Classes visited regularly to study water quality, identify species, and learn about ecology. I chaperoned one field trip, watching fourth graders get excited about finding caddisfly larvae under rocks in the stream. Their teacher, a woman named Ms. Anderson, told me that the creek had become a cornerstone of their environmental science curriculum. The kids love having a real-world example right here in the neighborhood, she said. It makes the concepts tangible. Watching those children explore the creek, I felt hopeful about the future. They were learning young that environmental protection mattered, that ecosystems were fragile, and that individual actions could make a difference. Maybe they'd grow up to be better stewards than my generation had been. The years that followed brought continued healing and growth. The creek matured into a robust ecosystem supporting dozens of species. The community continued to come together for maintenance and monitoring, and Willow Creek Estates developed a reputation as a model for environmental restoration and responsible governance. I never regretted making that phone call to the Division of Water Resources. It had been the right thing to do, even though it had triggered chaos and financial hardship. Because of that decision, a protected waterway was flowing again. Because of that decision, criminals had faced justice. And because of that decision, my community had learned lessons about accountability that would serve us for generations. Looking back on everything that had happened, standing beside Miller's Creek on a warm evening 5 years after the bulldozers first appeared, I felt peace. The water flowed clear and steady, just as it had for thousands of years before developers and HOA boards ever existed. Just as it would flow for thousands of years to come, protected now by law and by a community that understood its value. Melanie joined me at the creek's edge, slipping her hand into mine. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How things work out," I said. "Not always the way you expect or want, but they work out." She nodded, watching the water move past us. "The creek looks perfect. It'll get there," I said. "Give it another few years and you won't be able to tell it was ever damaged." We stood in comfortable silence, listening to the creek's quiet music and the evening songs of birds settling into the trees overhead. The HOA saga had ended, but life continued, flowing forward like the water at our feet, carrying us toward whatever challenges and triumphs lay ahead. And I was ready for it, knowing that when the next crisis came, I'd do what needed to be done. I'd ask the hard questions, demand accountability, and stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. Because that's what living in a community meant. Not just sharing a subdivision and paying dues, but actively protecting the things that mattered and holding each other responsible when we failed. The creek had taught me that lesson, and I wouldn't forget.